The morning her husband was buried, Sarah Whitlock heard her mother-in-law whisper something at the graveside. 4 words, quiet, almost kind. He deserved better. Sarah was still holding the folded flag. Her 7-year-old son was still holding her hand. The rain hadn't stopped yet, and the dirt on the casket was still dark and wet. She told herself she had imagined it. 3 months later, she knew she hadn't. The kitchen smelled like coffee that morning, black coffee. The kind Daniel used to drink before his shift at the lumber mill. Sarah had stopped making it for herself after the funeral, but Margaret still made it every day. Strong, bitter, the way her son used to like it. Sarah was at the sink, washing the same plate she had washed 20 minutes ago. She heard the chair scrape behind her. She heard the papers hit the table. She didn't turn around right away, because she knew some part of her had known for weeks. Sarah. She turned. Margaret was sitting at the head of the table, 64 years old, hair pinned back the way she always wore it, a cream-colored blouse buttoned all the way to the throat. Her hands folded over the papers like a woman saying grace. "Sit down, dear." Sarah didn't sit. Margaret didn't repeat herself. The papers were yellow at the edges, old. They had been waiting in a drawer somewhere for a long time. "The house is in my name, Sarah. It always was." Sarah felt the dish towel still in her hand. She didn't remember picking it up. "Daniel and I lived here for 8 years. I know. He told me, my son told you a lot of things." Margaret said it without raising her voice. That was the worst part. The calm, the way her mouth barely moved. "He told you he wanted you to be comfortable. He told you he wanted Caleb to grow up here. And I let him say those things because he was my son and he was happy and I loved him." She paused. "But he didn't put your name on anything, dear. Not the deed, not the bank account, not the truck. Did you ever wonder why?" Sarah didn't answer. She couldn't, because the answer was already crawling up her throat. The answer she had pushed down every time it surfaced in the last 4 months. The answer she had refused to look at in the eye. He had been 36 years old. Strong as an ox, he never thought he was going to die. That was the answer. But Margaret was waiting for a different one, a worse one. Howard needs the house. Howard, Daniel's younger brother, 38, the one who showed up to the funeral in a suit 2 sizes too small. The one who hugged her at the casket and whispered, "We'll figure this out, sis," with breath that smelled like bourbon. "He's selling it?" "He's taking it, Sarah." Margaret straightened the papers, tapped the edges against the table, once, twice. The way a teacher straightens a test. "I'm sorry. I really am. But the bank is involved now, and lawyers, and it isn't my decision anymore. It was always your decision." That came out before Sarah could stop it. Sharp. Loud. The dish towel was still in her hand. Margaret looked at her, just looked, and then said, "You have 24 hours. The boy was in the doorway. Sarah didn't know how long he had been standing there. Caleb was 7, small for his age, still in his pajamas, the ones with the tiny race cars on them. He was holding a wooden truck. Daniel had carved it for him the Christmas before last, out of pine, sanded smooth, painted red. Margaret saw where Sarah's eyes went. Her face changed, just a little, just enough. "He can stay, Sarah." Sarah didn't understand at first, and then she did, and then she felt something inside her chest go very still, the way a deer goes still when it hears a branch break. "He's my grandson. He has a room here. He has school. He has his father's things. I'm not throwing a child out in the cold, for heaven's sake. I'm not a monster." "Margaret, you're young. You can start over. You can find work. But the boy," "Margaret, the boy will have stability, a home, a school, everything Daniel wanted for him. I can give him that." Sarah looked at her son. Caleb was looking at the wooden truck in his hands. He wasn't crying. He hadn't cried much since the funeral. He just held things tighter. The truck, her sleeve, the corner of his blanket at night. Sarah looked back at Margaret, and she said the only thing she could say, I can barely survive myself. Margaret blinked. I'm sorry? That's what you're telling me, isn't it? That's what this is. You can barely survive yourself. So you're cutting me loose. So Howard can have the house. So the bank gets what it wants. And you're keeping my son like he's a piece of furniture you forgot to throw out. That is not. He goes with me. Sarah, be reasonable. He goes with me, Margaret. She walked across the kitchen. She knelt in front of her son. She put both hands on his small shoulders, felt how thin he was through the pajamas, felt the cold coming off him even though the kitchen was warm. Caleb, honey, go upstairs and put your boots on, the good ones, with the thick socks. Where are we going, Mama? She didn't know. She didn't know, but she heard herself say, somewhere far enough. There was an old backpack in the closet, Daniel's, the canvas one he used to take hunting. Sarah pulled it down and started filling it without thinking. 2 blankets, the wool ones from the linen closet, heavy, warm, half a loaf of bread, the end piece. The crust was hard. A box of matches, a pocket knife that had been her father's, a small first aid kit she kept under the bathroom sink. She had been a nursing assistant before Caleb was born. Old habits. Caleb's coat, his mittens, a second pair of socks. The photograph, the one of Daniel holding Caleb the day he was born, Sarah took it off the wall and slid it into the inside pocket of the backpack without looking at it, because if she looked at it, she wouldn't be able to leave. Margaret stood in the hallway the entire time, watching. She didn't say anything. She didn't help. She didn't stop her. Howard's car pulled into the driveway around 2 in the afternoon. Sarah heard the engine from the upstairs bedroom. She didn't go to the window. She knew what he looked like. She had known him for 9 years. She heard the front door open. She heard his voice in the kitchen. Low, familiar. The same voice that had told her at the casket they'd figure this out together. She's still here? She's packing. Jesus. Mom, I told you to. She's packing Howard. Pause. Then, quieter. Is the boy going with her? Yes. Mom? Don't, Howard, don't. Sarah closed the bedroom door. She finished packing. Daniel's truck was at the mill, locked up. Howard had the keys. He'd had them since the funeral. For safekeeping, he'd said. Sarah hadn't argued. She hadn't argued about anything in 4 months. But there was the old car, the Chevy, the one Daniel had been fixing up in the garage. It still ran, sort of. The transmission slipped in second gear and the heater only worked when it felt like it. But it ran. Margaret didn't stop her when she took the keys off the hook by the back door. Howard did. He came out into the garage as Sarah was loading the backpack into the trunk. He stood in the doorway with his hands in his pockets and his face arranged into the same expression he wore at the funeral. Sad. Apologetic. Careful. Sarah, don't. Where are you going to go? I don't know. You don't have to do this. Mom is she's grieving. She's not thinking clearly. Let me talk to her. Sarah closed the trunk. She turned around. She looked at her husband's brother, and she saw, finally, what she had refused to see for 9 years. He wasn't sad. He was relieved. She walked past him. She got in the car. She started the engine on the second try. Caleb was already in the passenger seat. He had buckled himself in. He had the wooden truck in his lap. Sarah backed out of the driveway. She didn't look at the house. She didn't look at Margaret in the kitchen window. She just drove. She drove north. She didn't know why. Maybe because south was the city, and the city was where Daniel's friends lived, and Daniel's friends would feel obligated to take her in for a night and then look at her with pity in the morning. Maybe because east was the coast and she had never liked the coast. Maybe because west was where Margaret's people came from. North was nothing. North was pine trees and old logging roads and small towns that closed at 6. North was a place where nobody knew her name. Caleb was quiet for the first hour. He held the wooden truck and watched the trees go by and didn't ask any questions. Sarah was grateful, because she didn't have answers. Around 4 in the afternoon, the heater finally gave up. She pulled over at a gas station, filled the tank with $37 of the $63 she had in her wallet, bought 2 bottles of water and a bag of pretzels and a chocolate bar for Caleb. The cashier looked at her boy and then looked at her and didn't say anything, but her eyes were kind. Sarah almost broke right there. She didn't. She got back in the car. She drove. The road got narrower. The shoulder turned to gravel. The pine trees got taller. The light started going. Caleb said, "Mama?" "Yes, baby." "Where are we going?" "Somewhere safe." "Is it far?" "Yes." "Will Daddy be there?" She had to pull over. She pulled the car onto the shoulder and put her head against the steering wheel, and she did not cry. She would not cry. Not in front of him. Not yet. She turned to her son. She reached across the seat and pushed his hair back from his forehead the way Daniel used to. "Daddy is with us, baby. Daddy is always with us. But where we're going, Daddy is going to be in our hearts. Okay? Not in the car, not in the house, but here." She put her hand over his small chest, right here, the whole time. Caleb nodded. He didn't say anything else. He looked out the window. Sarah pulled back onto the road. The car made it another hour, and then it didn't. The transmission went somewhere on a stretch of logging road that didn't have a name. The engine coughed twice, and then it stopped coughing. And then it just stopped. Sarah pumped the gas. She turned the key. She turned it again. Nothing. The car rolled to a halt against the gravel shoulder, and the silence that followed was the loudest silence Sarah had ever heard. She sat with her hands on the wheel. She breathed in, she breathed out. She looked at her son. "Caleb, honey, we're going to have to walk a little bit, just a little. Can you do that for me?" "Where are we walking to?" "I don't know yet, but we're going to find somewhere, I promise." She got out of the car. The cold hit her like a hand against the face. She hadn't realized how warm the car had been until she stepped into the air. The sun was almost gone. The pine trees were black against a gray sky. The road ahead of her was empty. The road behind her was empty. She opened the trunk. She took out the backpack. She wrapped one of the blankets around Caleb's shoulders and put his mittens on him and zipped his coat all the way to his chin. She locked the car. She didn't know why. Habit. She took her son's hand, and she started walking. The logging road was wet under their boots. There had been rain a few days before, the kind of rain that soaks into pine needles and doesn't leave for a long time. Their boots made small sucking sounds in the mud. Caleb kept up at first. Sarah was careful not to walk too fast. She kept looking down at him, checking his face, his lips, his hands inside the mittens. She talked to him to keep him moving. She told him about Daniel. She told him about the time Daniel had taken her camping when they were first dating and she had been afraid of bears, and Daniel had sat up all night with a flashlight pretending he wasn't tired. She told him about the way Daniel sang in the truck, badly, off-key, every Hank Williams song he could remember. She told him about the day Caleb was born, how Daniel had cried, how he had held the baby and looked at Sarah and said, "We made this. You and me. We actually made this." Caleb listened. He didn't say anything, but he kept walking. The light went. The light went, and the road got darker, and the pine trees on either side started to look like walls. Sarah took the small flashlight from the backpack. She hadn't checked the batteries. They were weak. The beam was yellow and narrow. It barely lit the ground in front of him. She kept walking. She didn't know what else to do. Caleb stumbled. He stumbled, and Sarah caught him by the elbow and lifted him back up, and she felt how light he was, and she felt something cold open up in her chest. "Mama, I'm tired." "I know, baby. My feet hurt." "I know. Can we stop?" She looked around. There was nowhere to stop. There was the road and the trees and the dark. Stopping meant sitting in the mud. Stopping meant the cold getting in. Stopping meant... She couldn't think about what stopping meant. She knelt down. She turned her back to him. "Climb on, baby. Mama's going to carry you for a little while." "I'm too big." "You are not too big. You are exactly the right size. Come on." He climbed onto her back. He weighed less than the backpack. Sarah stood up. Her knees popped. She shifted him higher and looped her arms under his legs, and she started walking again. She walked until her thighs burned. She walked until her shoulders shook. She walked until she couldn't feel her fingers anymore. She walked because if she stopped, she wouldn't start again. She talked to Daniel in her head. I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know where I'm going. I don't know how to do this without you. I don't know how to be a mother and a father and a roof and a meal. I don't know how to keep him warm. I don't know how to keep him safe. I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. And then she saw the fence. Uh, she almost missed it. The flashlight beam swept across the side of the road and caught something pale. Sarah stopped. She turned the light. Old wooden posts, buried in weeds and moss, the wire long gone. Half swallowed by the forest, a fence, which meant property, which meant a house. Maybe. She stepped off the road. Caleb stirred on her back. Mama? It's okay, baby. Stay with me. I think I see something. She climbed over the fallen fence. Her boot caught on a wire, and she almost went down. She didn't go down. She steadied herself. She kept walking. The trees got thicker. The undergrowth grabbed at her jeans. The flashlight beam danced ahead of her, weaker now, the batteries giving up. And then she saw it, a shape, darker than the dark around it, square, solid, a roof line, sagging on one side. A house, a small one. She walked closer. The flashlight finally died. Sarah hit it against her thigh. It flickered once and gave out. She stood in the dark for a moment, listening. There was no sound from the house, no light, no smoke, no dog barking, no voice, calling out, "Who's there?" She walked closer. The house was tiny, one story, maybe one room. The roof was caving on one side. One of the windows was broken. Vines climbed the walls like the forest had been trying to take it back for a long time. But the door was still there, and next to the door, half hidden under tall dead weeds, Sarah saw something that made her stop. Garden rows, straight ones. Someone had planted a garden here a long time ago. The rows were still visible, the way the earth had been turned, the way the stones had been laid along the edges. Somebody had loved this place. Sarah felt Caleb's breath against her neck. He was almost asleep on her back. She walked up to the door. She pushed it with her shoulder. It scraped against the floor. A wave of cold, dusty air drifted out from inside. The smell of old wood, of ashes, of years of silence. She stepped in. It was darker inside than out. She set Caleb down on something soft, a chair, she thought, with a blanket on it. She put her hands out in front of her, and she felt her way across the room. She found the stove, a small iron one, in the center of the room, cold but solid, not broken. She knelt down in front of it. She opened the door. She felt inside. There were ashes, old ones, powder fine. She stood up. She felt her way. Along the wall, she found shelves. Empty. A lantern hanging from a nail. Empty, too. And then her hand touched something stacked against the wall by the stove. Firewood. Dry firewood, protected from the rain. A small stack. Not much, but enough. Sarah's eyes filled. She didn't let them spill. Not yet. She crossed back to the backpack. She felt for the matches. She found them. She crossed back to the stove. She took 2 pieces of the firewood and laid them inside. She struck the first match. It snapped in her hand. She struck the second. It flared and died. She had 3 left. She knelt very close to the stove. She cupped her hand around the third match. She struck it slow, careful, patient. It caught. She held it under the smallest piece of kindling she could find. The flame trembled, almost went out. She blew on it the way Daniel had taught her at that campsite 9 years ago. It caught a small orange tongue of fire, then a bigger one. Then the wood started to crackle. Sarah closed the stove door halfway. She sat back on her heels. She watched the light grow. Caleb was already asleep on the chair, curled up under a dusty blanket she didn't remember covering him with. She must have done it. She didn't remember. She crossed to him. She sat down on the floor next to him. She pulled her knees up to her chest. And finally, she let herself cry. Not loud, Not the kind of crying that wakes children, just quiet, shoulders shaking, hand over her mouth. She cried for Daniel, she cried for Caleb, she cried for the woman she had been 4 months ago who still believed her life made sense. She cried until she didn't have anything left. And then she sat there in the orange light, watching her son sleep. In a house she had never seen before, in a forest she didn't know the name of, in the middle of a country that had decided it didn't need her anymore. She slept on the floor by the stove that night. She didn't dream. She was too tired to dream. She woke up because the fire had gone down. Gray light was coming through the broken window, the kind of light that doesn't have any warmth in it. Sarah sat up. Her back hurt, her neck hurt, her hands were stiff. Caleb was still asleep on the chair. She stood up slowly. She fed 2 more pieces of wood to the stove. She closed the door. She crossed to the broken window and looked out. The forest in daylight was nothing like the forest at night. The pine trees were enormous, taller than she had realized. The light came down through them in long, pale columns. There was frost on the ground, frost on the dead weeds, frost on the garden rose she had seen the night before. The garden rows were even clearer in the daylight. Sarah stepped outside. The porch creaked under her boots. The boards were soft, rotting, but they held. She walked around the side of the house. The garden was bigger than she had thought, 6 rows, maybe 7, all straight, all bordered with small stones. Whoever had built this had taken their time. She knelt down and pushed the dead weeds aside. Underneath was good soil, dark, loose, loved. She stood up. She looked at the house, really looked at it. It was small. It was broken. The roof was sagging, and the window was gone, and the porch was rotten. But it had a stove, and firewood, and a garden. And it wasn't somebody else's house. Nobody was going to walk in and hand her papers and tell her she had 24 hours. She walked further, behind the house, looking. That was when she heard it. Water, not rain, not dripping, flowing. She followed the sound. She pushed through dead brush. She climbed over a fallen log. She found a patch of ground covered with mossy boards and tangled roots. She pulled the boards aside. Underneath was a narrow door set into the earth, a cellar door. The hinges were rusted shut. She pulled harder. They groaned. They gave. Cold air rushed up from below, the smell of stone, the smell of moving water. Sarah climbed down. The cellar was small. Stone walls. Wooden shelves on either side, most of them empty. A few dusty jars, a few rotten potatoes, a lantern hanging from a hook. And at the back of the cellar, water flowed quietly from a crack in the stone into a shallow basin carved out of the rock. Clear, cold, constant. Sarah knelt down. She cupped her hand. She drank. It was the cleanest water she had ever tasted in her life. She stayed there a long time, on her knees, in the cold, dim cellar, drinking from a spring that someone had carved into the rock decades ago. And she said out loud to nobody, "We're going to be okay." She didn't know if she believed it, but she said it because she needed to hear someone say it. When she climbed back up out of the cellar, Caleb was standing on the porch in his coat. The wooden truck was in his hand. He was looking at the garden rows. He was looking at the pine trees. He was looking at the smoke just starting to rise from the chimney. He turned when he heard her. "Mama?" "Yes, baby." "Whose house is this?" Sarah opened her mouth to say, "I don't know." But she didn't say it, because something stopped her. Because the garden was too straight, because the firewood had been stacked too neatly, because the cellar door had been covered with boards on purpose, because somebody had taken the time to carve a basin out of stone for the water to fall into. This house wasn't abandoned. This house had been left and waiting for somebody. Sarah looked at her son. She thought of the cold cellar and the running water and the firewood and the garden rows. She thought of Margaret's voice. He deserved better. She thought of Daniel saying, "We made this, you and me." And she said to her son, "I think this house is ours, baby. For a little while. I think this house has been waiting for us. Caleb didn't ask any more questions. He came down off the porch and he took her hand and they walked back inside together. The stove was warm now. The little room was already brighter. The dust was already starting to settle in different places. Sarah unpacked the backpack. Slowly, carefully. She put the matches on the shelf by the stove. She put the pocket knife on the table. She took out the photograph of Daniel holding Caleb and she set it upright on the windowsill by the broken window so Daniel could see them, so they could see Daniel. She made breakfast out of half the bread and one of the bottles of water and the chocolate bar split in two. Caleb ate sitting on the chair under the dusty blanket. Sarah ate sitting on the floor. After breakfast, she stood up, she looked around the small room, she rolled up her sleeves. There was so much to do. She started with the stove. She cleaned out the old ashes with a piece of cardboard from the backpack. She wiped down the top with a rag from her own coat pocket. She fed it 3 more pieces of firewood. She was reaching for the next piece when she noticed something, the bricks around the base of the stove. One of them was loose. She could see it. The mortar around it had crumbled away. The brick itself was sitting slightly out of line with the others. She set the firewood down. She knelt closer. She put her fingers around the edge of the loose brick. She wiggled it. It came free easily like it had been moved before. Behind the brick was a small, hollow space, and in the space, wrapped in a piece of brown cloth, was a book. Sarah pulled it out carefully. The cloth was soft with age. She unwrapped it. A Bible. Old, black leather, worn at the corners, the kind that had been carried to church every Sunday for years and years. Sarah opened it. The pages were thin. They smelled like dust and time. Some of the verses had been underlined in pencil. Soft strokes, a woman's hand. And tucked between 2 of the pages, near the middle, was a photograph, black and white, square. The edges scalloped the way old photographs used to be. Sarah pulled it out carefully. A woman stood in the garden. This garden. The same straight rows, the same stone borders, the same pine trees behind her. She was holding a little girl, maybe 6 years old. The little girl was laughing. The woman was looking down at her, smiling, the way a mother smiles when she thinks nobody is watching. Sarah turned the photograph over. On the back, in faded blue ink, in handwriting that looked like it had been written slowly and carefully, Ruth and Hannah, summer 1961. Sarah sat back on her heels. She held the photograph in one hand, the Bible in the other. She looked at the woman. She looked at the little girl. She looked at the garden rose outside the window. And she understood all at once, with a certainty she couldn't explain, that this house had been waiting 58 years for somebody to come back. Caleb came over and sat down next to her on the floor. He looked at the photograph in her hand. "Who is that, Mama?" Sarah looked at her son. She looked at the woman in the photograph, and she said very quietly, "I think she's the person who saved us, baby. I think she saved us a long time ago. We just didn't know yet." Outside, the wind moved through the pine trees. The smoke rose from the chimney, and the little cottage that had been quiet for 58 years finally, for the first time in a very long time, felt like somebody had come home. The first week, Sarah learned the sound of the cottage. Every house has one. A breath, a pulse, the way the floorboards settle in the cold, the way the wind finds the cracks in the walls and whistles through them at 3 in the morning, the way the stove ticks as the metal cools. She learned which board by the door creaked and which one didn't. She learned that the window over the kitchen counter rattled in the east wind but not the west. She learned that the back porch made a sharp sound when you stepped on the second step, but only if you stepped on the right side. She learned because she had to, because every sound that wasn't the house was something she needed to hear. Caleb learned too, differently, faster, the way children learn. By the third morning, he was helping, without being asked. He carried small pieces of firewood from the porch to the stove. He sorted the dry beans she found in a rusted tin into 2 piles, good ones and bad ones. He collected pine needles in a paper sack and stuffed them into the cracks under the door. He still didn't talk much, but He was looking at her again. That was the difference. Since the funeral, he had stopped looking at her. He had looked at his hands, at the floor, at the wooden truck, but not at her, not really. Now he looked at her. Sarah held on to that look the way other women hold on to their wedding rings. The fourth morning, Sarah found the creek. She had gone out at dawn with the axe she'd found leaning against the side of the cottage. She wanted firewood. She wanted to know the land. She wanted to walk in a direction that wasn't away from something for the first time in 3 months. She walked downhill from the cellar, followed the sound of the spring as far as she could. The water disappeared into the ground for a while and then came back up, joined another small stream, then another, until it became a creek. The creek was narrow but moving fast, cold, clear, full of small flat rocks. Sarah stood at the edge for a long time. She thought of Daniel. Daniel had taught her to fish, not because she wanted to learn, because he had wanted to teach her. Their second summer together. A trout stream in the mountains. He'd been so patient. He'd shown her how to read the water, where the fish would be holding. Why you cast upstream and let the current carry the line. She had pretended to find it boring. She had not found it boring. Sarah took off her boots. She rolled up her jeans. She stepped into the creek. The cold was a shock, the kind of cold that goes straight to the bone. She gasped. She almost laughed. She thought, Daniel, you wouldn't believe this. She didn't have a fishing line. She didn't have a hook. She didn't have anything but her hands and what Daniel had taught her about reading the water. She stood very still. She waited. A small shadow drifted under the bank. Then another. Sarah moved her hands under the water. Slow, slower. The way Daniel had said, don't grab, cradle. She came up with a trout the size of her palm. She stared at it. It stared back, and then she laughed, out loud, alone in a creek in the middle of nowhere with cold legs and a small fish in her hands. She laughed. She caught another one 20 minutes later. She wrapped them in her jacket and walked back to the cottage, and when Caleb saw what she was carrying, his face did something it hadn't done since October. It opened. That was the only word for it. His face opened. You caught those? I caught those. With what? With my hands. Mama, I'm telling you, baby. With my hands? He couldn't stop looking at the fish. He kept poking them, gently, like he wasn't sure they were real. Sarah cleaned them on the porch with the pocket knife. She found a cast-iron pan on the top shelf of the cupboard, black with age. She washed it in the spring water. She set it on top of the stove. She had no oil, no salt, no anything, but she had a fish and a hot pan and a son who was looking at her again. The cottage smelled like a meal that night, like a real meal, cooked by somebody who lived there. Sarah hadn't smelled that since October. The next morning she went further. She walked downhill past the creek, past a stand of birch trees, past a clearing where the wind made the dry grass move in waves, and then the forest opened. She stopped. Apple trees, dozens of them, maybe 40, maybe more, in crooked rows that had been straight a long time ago. The branches were wild, unpruned for years. Many of the trees were dead, but some weren't. And some still had fruit. Small red apples, hanging high above the dead weeds, glowing in the cold, pale light like ornaments somebody had forgotten to take down. Sarah walked into the orchard, slow. She didn't know who had planted these trees. 40 trees. That wasn't a hobby. That was a life. Somebody had stood here with a shovel and a sapling 40 times and waited for the trees to come up and waited for them to bear and tended them through years and years and years until they didn't anymore, until something happened, until somebody left or died or got taken away. Sarah filled her jacket with apples, as many as she could carry. The branches were too high in places. She had to climb. She hadn't climbed a tree since she was 12 years old. At the far edge of the orchard, past a collapsed wooden shed, she found the walnut tree. It was enormous. The trunk was as wide as she was tall. The ground beneath it was covered with cracked shells hidden under the leaves. Real food. the kind that would last all winter. She filled both pockets. She filled the empty paper bag she'd brought. She thought, whoever you were, thank you, thank you, thank you. When she walked back to the cottage with apples in her jacket and walnuts in her pockets and the axe over her shoulder, Caleb was on the porch, watching for her. He'd been watching the whole time. She hadn't told him to. He'd just done it. That night they roasted apples beside the stove. The smell filled the small room, sweet and dark. Caleb didn't eat his apple. He held it. He smelled it. He watched the firelight on the skin. Sarah said, "Eat it, baby." He said, "It smells like Daddy." Sarah didn't ask why. She didn't trust her voice. She just nodded. She watched her son eat a hot apple in the firelight in a cottage that didn't belong to either of them. And she thought, he's coming back. Piece by piece, he's coming back. The next morning, walking out to gather more wood, she saw it in the mud near the broken fence, half hidden under fallen pine needles. Just enough to see clearly. A footprint. Sarah stopped walking. She stood very still. She looked at the print. It was big, a man's boot, size 12 at least. The tread was deep, recent. The frost from the night before was already melted around the edges. Somebody had been here in the last 12 hours. Sarah felt her heart move into her throat. She didn't run. She didn't call for Caleb. She walked, slow, deliberate, the way you walk when you don't want a predator to know you've seen it. She walked the perimeter of the cottage. She found 3 more prints, by the fence, by the side of the porch, one in the soft earth at the edge of the garden. Whoever it was had walked all the way around the cottage, in the night, and had not knocked, had not called out, had not done anything, just walked, looked, left. Sarah went back inside. She closed the door. She slid the rusted iron bolt that probably hadn't worked in 50 years. Surprisingly, it still moved. She found a piece of baling wire on the shelf, and she wound it around the bolt and the latch, and she twisted it tight. Caleb was at the table, eating roasted walnuts off a tin plate. He looked up. "Mama." "Hi, baby. You look funny." "I look funny?" "Your face is funny." Sarah forced a smile. "I'm just cold, baby. From outside. Are you full?" He nodded. She didn't tell him about the footprints. But that night, after he was asleep, she moved the axe from the porch to inside the cottage. She propped it up against the wall next to the chair where she'd been sleeping, where she could reach it without standing. And she didn't sleep much. She lay in the dim orange light and listened to the cottage breathe. She listened past the cottage. She listened to the forest. She listened to every cracking branch, every distant owl, every shift of snow on a pine bough. She did not hear footsteps, but she knew the way women know things. He was out there. She picked up the Bible the next morning. She hadn't looked at it again since the first day. She had been afraid, not of the book itself, of what the book might tell her. She sat in the chair by the stove. The cottage was quiet. Caleb was outside, breaking small branches off a downed pine and dragging them back one at a time, like he was an important man with an important job. Sarah opened the Bible. She turned the pages slowly. She found the passage that had been underlined in soft pencil. She watches over the affairs of her household and does not eat the bread of idleness. Proverbs 31. Sarah knew the chapter. Her own mother had read it to her once, a long time ago. But somebody else had underlined this verse, decades before Sarah was born. A woman with a soft hand in a cottage in the woods, watching over the affairs of her household. Sarah turned more pages, and between 2 pages near the middle, she found it, a letter, folded into quarters, thin paper, yellow at the creases. The ink had faded, but it was still readable. Sarah unfolded the letter with hands that weren't quite steady. The date at the top read the 14th of October, 1967, 59 years ago. She read, "My dearest Hannah, if you ever find this letter, please know that your mother tried. I tried so hard to keep you. I want you to know that first, before you read anything else. I tried. They said I wasn't fit. They said a woman alone, without a husband, without family standing behind her, could not raise a child. They said you would be better off. They said it the way they always said it, with paperwork, with signatures, with men in suits who would not look me in the eye. The judge took less than an hour. Your grandparents have you now. They will tell you things about me. They will tell you I was unstable. They will tell you I was unfit. They will tell you I did not love you enough to keep you. Please, Hannah, please, if you ever read this, know that those are not true things. Those are the things people say to make themselves feel better about taking a child away from her mother. I built this house with my brother. I planted the garden myself. I planted the apple trees because I wanted you to have apples when you were grown. I planted the walnut tree because Silas said it would outlive both of us. I dug the spring with my own hands. This place is yours. Every board, every stone, every root, yours. If you ever come back, if you ever find your way here, if you ever stand in this kitchen and read these words, take care of it the way I would have, the way I am no longer allowed to. And if I am not here, if by the time you find this I am gone, please know I never stopped. Not for a single day, not for a single hour. I love you, I love you, I love you. Your mother, Ruth, Sarah was crying before she finished reading. She didn't make a sound. She just sat in the chair with the letter in her lap and tears running down her face, and her hand pressed flat against the page like she could reach through the paper. Ruth. Ruth had built this house. Ruth had planted the garden. Ruth had dug the spring. Ruth had lost her child. And Ruth had written a letter that nobody ever read. Until now. Until Sarah, she read it again. And then a third time, the light through the cottage window had moved across the floor by the time she folded the letter and put it back inside the Bible. She sat there, holding it, thinking. Silas, that was the brother's name. The one who said the walnut tree would outlive them, the one who helped Ruth build this house in the woods. Sarah looked at the door. She thought about the footprints. She thought, no, he'd be ancient, 80, maybe older. Even if he were still alive, he wouldn't be wandering around in the snow. She thought, unless... She didn't finish the thought. Caleb came in. He had a small piece of pine in his hand. He held it up to her. Look, Mama, it looks like a fish. Sarah wiped her face on her sleeve. She took the piece of pine. She turned it. He was right. The grain curved in a way that did look like a fish. It does, baby. It really does. Why are you crying? She hesitated. She thought, he's 7. He's already lost more than most adults lose in a lifetime. She thought, I will not lie to him. Not about anything that matters. She said, I read something sad. What did you read? I read a letter from a woman who used to live here a long time ago, before either of us was born. Her name was Ruth. Ruth? Yes, baby. What happened to her? Sarah took a breath. They took her little girl away from her, and it broke her heart. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he said, did they take her little girl because she didn't have any money? Sarah looked at him sharply. He wasn't asking about Ruth. He was asking about her. She pulled him close. She held him against her chest. She felt his small body, his warm head against her collarbone, the steady beat of his heart against hers. Nobody is taking you, Caleb. Do you hear me? Nobody. Not your grandmother, not your uncle, not a judge, not anybody. They would have to go through me. And I am not as easy to go through as I look. He held on to her sleeve. He said, okay, Mama. He said it small, but he said it, and Sarah felt something settle in her chest. Hard, cold, final. A promise. The kind women make when nobody else is around to hear it. Over my body, over my dead body. Never again. The snow came that night, the first real snow, not the dusting they'd had 2 mornings before. Real snow. Fat flakes drifting down in the firelight outside the window. The kind of snow that means winter is no longer coming. Winter is already here. Sarah added more wood to the stove. She closed the door tight. She wound the baling wire one extra time. Caleb was already asleep on the chair under 3 blankets. He had the wooden truck against his chest. Sarah stood at the window for a long time, watching the snow fall. She thought about Ruth. She thought about the letter. She thought about how a woman 59 years ago had stood at this same window, watching this same snow, wondering if her daughter was warm, wondering if her daughter was loved, wondering if she would ever see her daughter again. She thought, I am not Ruth. I have my son. I have him. I have him. She thought, but what if I lose him too? She didn't let herself finish that thought. She turned away from the window. She lay down on the floor next to Caleb's chair. She pulled a blanket over herself. She listened to the snow. She slept. Around 2 in the morning, Caleb started to cough. Sarah came awake the way mothers come awake, instantly, already moving before her eyes were fully open. She put her hand on his forehead. He was burning, not warm, not feverish, burning. Sarah felt her own face go cold. Baby. Caleb. Wake up, honey, wake up. He opened his eyes. They were glassy. Mama, my throat hurts. I know, baby. Mama, I'm cold. He was sweating, soaking through his shirt, but shivering. Sarah knew what that meant. She knew because she had been a nursing assistant for 2 years before Caleb was born. She had checked enough fevers to know the difference between a child with a cold and a child with something worse. This was something worse. She felt his throat. The glands were swollen, hard, the size of grapes. She looked in his mouth with the flashlight she had brought from the car. The back of his throat was red, streaked white. Strep, maybe, or worse. She felt her own panic for 1 full second, and then she put it away. She put it away the way you put things away when there isn't time for them. She thought about what she had. A first aid kit, aspirin, bandages, antiseptic, some gauze, a thermometer. She used the thermometer. The number came up and Sarah stared at it. 103. In a 7-year-old. In a cottage in the woods. With no telephone. No car. No neighbors. No road open. With snow falling outside and the temperature dropping and a man's footprints in the mud less than 12 hours old. She heard herself say, out loud, okay, okay, okay. She gave him an aspirin. A half. Children's dose. The way she'd been taught. She gave him water. She wiped him down with a damp cloth. His fever didn't break. It went up. By 4 in the morning, it was 104.2. Sarah stood in the middle of the cottage with her son shivering on the chair and her hands shaking so hard she had to grip them together. She had to get him medicine, real medicine, antibiotics, penicillin, something. There was no road open, there was no telephone, there was no car that ran. But she remembered from the gas station, miles ago, she remembered seeing a sign, brushwood 4 miles, a town, a small one. Or the gas station wouldn't have bothered putting up a sign. 4 miles. In the snow. On foot. Leaving her 7-year-old son alone in a cottage in the woods with a fever of 104. Sarah knelt down in front of the chair. She put both hands on Caleb's face. Baby, listen to Mama. Listen to me. He looked at her with glassy eyes. Mama is going to go get medicine for you. Mama's going to walk into town and get medicine and come right back. As fast as I can. Do you understand? Don't go, Mama. Baby, don't go. Don't go. Don't go. Caleb. Look at me, baby. He looked. I will come back. I will come back faster than you can imagine. The stove will be on. The door will be locked. I am going to leave you the wooden truck. And a photograph of Daddy. And I am going to draw a clock on this piece of paper. And I am going to set it for when I come back, and I am going to come back before the big hand gets to hear. Do you understand me? He nodded. Small, slow. She kissed his forehead. It was so hot her lips felt scorched. She put another log in the stove. She filled the pan with water from the spring jug so he'd have water by the chair. She set out the aspirin bottle with very clear instructions written in pencil on a piece of paper. She put on every layer of clothing she had. She picked up the axe. Not because she was going to chop anything, because she was a woman walking alone in the woods in the dark, because she had seen footprints, because she was not stupid. She stopped at the door. She turned back. Her son was small in the chair, so small. The blanket was up to his chin. His eyes were on her. She said, "I love you, Caleb Whitlock. I love you more than there are stars." He whispered, "I love you too, Mama." Sarah opened the door. The cold went through her like a blade. She closed the door behind her. She turned the latch. She heard the bolt click, and she started walking. The snow was deeper than she expected, almost to her knees in places. The wind came in sideways. The pine trees roared above her like an ocean she couldn't see. She walked. She walked because there was nothing else to do. She thought of Ruth. She thought of Ruth walking these same woods 60 years ago, carrying water, carrying firewood, carrying her daughter when her daughter was small, standing at this same edge of the forest, looking out at this same snow. Sarah found the logging road, followed it. The Chevy was still there, snow piled on the roof like a cake. She walked past it. She walked for 2 hours. Her face went numb. Her hands went numb inside the mittens. Her feet were so cold she stopped being able to feel where the ground was. Twice she fell. Twice she got up. She thought, "If I die out here, who will know to go back for him?" She thought, "Don't die out here. Don't you dare die out here." She thought, "Daniel, Daniel, help me. Help me get there. Help me get back." And finally, she saw light. A street light. One, yellow, weak, visible through the snow. She stumbled toward it. Brushwood, Maine, a general store, a post office, a church with a leaning steeple, a bar with one truck in front of it, a pharmacy. The pharmacy was open. The sign in the window said open. The light was on inside. Sarah half walked, half fell against the door. The bell over the door jingled when she pushed through. The man behind the counter looked up. He was old, maybe 70, white hair, reading glasses, a flannel shirt under a wool vest. He stared at her like she was a ghost. She probably looked like one. "Ma'am." He came around the counter. "Ma'am, are you—" "My son, fever, 104. I think it's strep. I need penicillin. I need it now." "Ma'am, I can't just—" "I was a nursing assistant, 2 years, Mercy General in Augusta. I know what he has. I know what he needs. Please." "Where is he?" "In a cottage. In the woods. About 4 miles north." The old man's hand stopped halfway to his shelf. He turned. Slow. He looked at her. His face had gone strange. "What cottage?" Sarah was shaking too hard to speak clearly. "Old cottage, off a logging road. There's a garden, and apple trees, and a spring under the cellar." Sarah stopped breathing. "Yes." The old man stared at her. He stared at her for so long, Sarah thought he might be having a stroke. And then he said, in a voice that wasn't quite his own, "You're staying in Ruth Mercer's house?" The world went quiet. Sarah heard the snow against the pharmacy window. She heard the heater clicking. She heard her own heartbeat in her ears. She said, "You knew her." The old man took off his reading glasses. He wiped them on his vest. He put them back on. He said, "Everybody knew her. Everybody in this town. And every single one of us failed her." He turned to his shelf. He got the medicine. He didn't ask for a prescription. He didn't ask for money. He put the bottle in a paper bag. He put cough syrup with it. He put fever reducer with it. He put electrolyte powder with it. He put a thermometer with it. He pushed it across the counter to Sarah. He said, "You take that to your boy, you make him well, and then you come back here. Because there are things you need to know." Sarah grabbed the bag. She turned for the door. The old man's voice stopped her. "Mum." She turned. "What's your name?" "Sarah Whitlock." He nodded slowly, like he was sealing something in his memory. "My name is Walter Crane. I have lived in this town for 73 years, and I have waited a long time for somebody to find that house." Sarah held the bag against her chest. She didn't ask him what he meant. She didn't have time. She walked out of the pharmacy into the snow, and she started walking back 4 miles with the bag in her arms, the wind in her face, her son's name on her lips, like a prayer. She got back at sunrise. Caleb was asleep on the chair. The fire was almost out. The blanket had slipped to his waist. Sarah broke down right there in the doorway. She dropped to her knees on the cold floor. She cried for 10 seconds. Just 10. And then she got up and she fed the stove and she crushed the penicillin into water and she woke him up gently and she got it into him. By that afternoon, his fever had dropped to 101. By that night, it was 100 even. By the next morning, he was sitting up asking for soup. Sarah didn't have soup. She had warm water with crushed walnuts in it. He drank it. He went back to sleep. She sat next to him for hours, watching him breathe. Walter Crane's voice was in her head the whole time. Everybody knew her, and every single one of us failed her. 3 nights later, after Caleb was clearly out of danger, Sarah was reading by the stove when she heard it. 3 knocks, soft, polite, spaced exactly evenly. She went still. She listened. Nothing. She didn't move for a long time. When she finally opened the door, an hour later, just to look, just to see, there was nothing there. But on the porch, stacked neatly, as if by someone who had taken his time, was a small bundle of dry split firewood, a paper sack of flour, a bottle of milk, a small wedge of cheese wrapped in wax paper, and tucked under the bundle, where the snow wouldn't reach it, a piece of folded paper. Sarah opened it with shaking hands. The note was written in pencil. The handwriting was the same handwriting from the back of the photograph. Slow and careful. A man's hand. An old man's hand. It said only this: "The boy will be all right. So will you. Please do not be afraid of me." Sarah looked up, out into the dark, out into the trees, out into the snow. And somewhere out there, she felt him standing, still, quiet, watching the smoke rise from the chimney like he had been watching it for a very long time. She didn't know who he was. Not yet. Not all the way. But she knew now. She knew he was the brother in the letter. She knew he had been waiting, just like the cottage had been waiting for her to come home. Sarah didn't sleep that night. She sat by the stove with the note in her lap, and she read it again every 20 minutes or so, as if the words might change, as if she might learn something new by staring at the same pencil strokes for the 40th time. "The boy will be all right. So will you. Please do not be afraid of me." She wasn't afraid. That was the strange thing. She should have been. A woman alone in the woods with a sick child and a strange old man leaving things on the porch in the dark. That was the kind of story that ended with police tape. But she wasn't afraid. She was something else. She was tired, bone tired, the kind of tired that goes deeper than sleep, the kind of tired that comes from carrying something heavy for so long you've forgotten how to put it down. And under the tired, way underneath, was something that almost felt like recognition, like she'd been expecting him. By the 4th morning, Caleb was sitting up at the table eating roasted apples for breakfast. The fever was gone. The swelling in his throat was gone. The color was back in his cheeks. He was talking, asking questions, asking too many questions. The way children do when they've been quiet for too long and the silence finally breaks. "Mama, why does that brick come out of the wall?" "It just does, baby." "Why?" "Because somebody made it that way." "Why?" "Because they wanted to hide something." "What did they want to hide?" "A book." "Why?" "Because the book had a secret in it." "What was the secret?" Sarah looked at him. She looked at her son. Healthy, annoying, asking too many questions, alive. She said, "The secret is that this house used to belong to a woman named Ruth, and she had a little girl just like Daddy and I had you, and she loved her little girl more than anything in the world. What happened to the little girl? Some people took her away." "Why?" "Because they were wrong, baby. Just wrong. They thought a mother who didn't have a husband couldn't take care of her child, so they took the child away from the mother." Caleb chewed his apple slowly. He said, "Are they going to take me away?" Sarah's hand went still on the cup she was holding. She set it down. She walked around the table. She knelt down next to his chair. She put her hand against his cheek. She said, "Listen to me, Caleb Whitlock. There is nobody on this earth who is taking you away from me. Not now, not ever. Do you understand? They could come with 100 lawyers. They could come with the whole United States Army. And I would stand between them and you until I dropped. Do you hear me?" He nodded. He said, "Okay." He said it small, but he said it. And then he said, "But what about the other mama?" Sarah stopped. He was asking about Ruth. "What about her, baby? Did anyone stand between her and them?" Sarah looked at her son. She looked at the wooden truck on the table, the truck Daniel had carved, the truck that had ridden in the car with them away from a house they'd been thrown out of. She said, "I don't know yet, baby, but I'm going to find out." That afternoon, Sarah did something she hadn't planned to do. She put on her coat, her hat, her mittens. She told Caleb he could come with her or stay by the stove. He chose stove. She kissed the top of his head. She told him she'd be back in an hour. She walked the perimeter of the cottage. Not for footprints this time. For him, she walked the fence line. She walked along the spring. She walked through the dead garden rows. She walked out to the edge of the apple orchard. She walked under the walnut tree and stood there a long time with her hands in her pockets. She said out loud, "I know you're out there." The pine trees swallowed the sound. She said, "I'm not going to chase you. I'm not going to call the sheriff. I'm not going to do anything except what I'm doing right now. I am standing here and I am telling you that when you are ready, the door is open." She didn't expect an answer. She didn't get one. But that night, when she went out for one last armload of firewood before bed, there were fresh boot prints in the snow at the edge of the porch. He had been there, listening. He hadn't come in, but he had been there. 2 days later, Sarah walked the 4 miles into brushwood again. She left Caleb with strict instructions. She gave him crayons she'd bought at the gas station weeks ago, a pad of paper, the Bible to look at the pictures of saints with their gold halos. She told him not to open the door for anyone. Anyone. Even somebody who sounded nice. Even somebody who said they knew Mama. He nodded gravely. Sarah walked. The snow was packed harder this time. The path was easier. She made it in just under 2 hours. The pharmacy bell jingled when she pushed through the door. Walter Crane was behind the counter. He looked up. He saw her. His face changed. Not surprise. Relief. "Sarah Whitlock. Walter Crane. You came back. You said there were things I needed to know." He nodded. He flipped the sign in the window from open to back in an hour. He led her to the back of the pharmacy. There was a small office, a desk, 2 chairs, a coffee pot, a photograph on the wall of a younger Walter, much younger, standing in front of a building with a banner over the door. Sarah couldn't read the banner. He poured her coffee. He poured himself coffee. He sat down across from her. He didn't waste time. He said, "Ruth Mercer was my best friend's older sister." Sarah set down her coffee. She waited. I grew up 2 houses from them, in the old part of town before they tore those houses down for the new road. Her family was poor. Her father drank. Her mother worked 3 jobs. Ruth practically raised her younger brother, Silas. He was 20 years younger than her. She was more of a mother to him than their actual mother ever was. Walter took off his glasses, wiped them, put them back on. Ruth was 23 when she met him, a man named Robert Bellamy. He was 30, lived 2 towns over. He came through here on business. He courted her for 6 months, promised her the moon. Then she got pregnant. Sarah held her coffee with both hands. He proposed when she told him. She accepted. She thought everything was settled. But before they could marry, before the announcement, before the paperwork, he met somebody else. Somebody from his own circles. Somebody with money. And he changed his mind about all of it. He left her. He more than left her. He denied her. He told his family the baby wasn't his. He told the Bellamy lawyers to make her go away. They offered her $200 to sign a paper saying she wouldn't make any claim on him or his future estate. She wouldn't sign. She said she'd raise the child alone before she'd take a single dime from a man who didn't want them. Walter looked into his coffee. She had Hannah in the spring of 1955, right here in this town, in the back room of Dr. Henderson's house, because Bellamy money had reached the hospital and they wouldn't admit her. Sarah felt the bones in her hands. She felt them aching from how hard she was gripping the cup. She raised that little girl for 6 years, just her, by herself. She worked as a seamstress. She took in laundry. She cleaned houses. The Bellamys left her alone for a while. They had bigger things to worry about, and Ruth had everybody in town watching out for her. Silas grew up tall and strong, and he protected her the way she had protected him. And then in 1961, Robert Bellamy died. Sarah waited, and his family realized that they had a granddaughter out there, a blood granddaughter, and no other heirs. And suddenly, Ruth Mercer was not an inconvenience anymore. Suddenly, she was a thief. Suddenly, Hannah belonged to the Bellamys, and they had the lawyers and the judges and the money to make that real. They sued for custody. They didn't sue. They didn't have to sue. They went to a friendly judge in Augusta. They presented a case that said Ruth Mercer was an unmarried woman, no husband, no man in her household, raising a child in poverty. That child deserved a stable home. The judge agreed. 3 weeks later, sheriff's deputies came to Ruth's apartment with a court order. Sarah closed her eyes. She fought them. She wouldn't open the door. They broke it down. They took Hannah out of her arms. The little girl was screaming. Ruth was screaming. The whole street was screaming. And the deputies took that child away in a black car, and Ruth never saw her again. Sarah pressed her hand over her mouth. Walter waited. After Hannah was taken, Ruth couldn't stay in town. Everywhere she went, somebody had seen it. The whole town had watched. She couldn't be where she had been a mother. She couldn't walk past the school. She couldn't walk past the park. She broke, just broke. So she went into the woods. Silas had a piece of land inherited from an uncle on his mother's side, out where nobody lived, just trees. He took her out there in his truck. He built that cottage with her, just the two of them. Hammer and nails. 2 seasons. He dug that spring with a pickaxe. He planted those apple trees. He told her the walnut would outlive both of them. He said it because she needed something to outlive her. Walter's eyes were wet now. He didn't wipe them. She lived out there for 7 years and mostly alone. Silas brought her supplies. He brought her news. He kept trying to find Hannah. He hired a lawyer in Augusta. The lawyer took his money and did nothing. He went to the Bellamy house in person. They had the police remove him. He tried letters. The Bellamys returned them unopened. And Ruth got sicker every year. Not in her body, in her spirit. She kept the garden. She wrote letters to her daughter that she never sent. She read her Bible. She prayed. But every year she got smaller, thinner, quieter. By the 7th year, she was barely eating. What happened to her, Walter? He looked up. Pneumonia. The winter of 1968. She wouldn't come into town. Silas tried to make her. She wouldn't. By the time he got to her with a doctor, she was already gone. He found her in that cottage, in the chair by the stove, with her Bible in her lap. Sarah didn't try to speak. She couldn't. Walter said he buried her himself under the walnut tree. He said she'd asked him to. He said she wanted to be where she could keep watching the garden. And he buried her there, and he closed the cottage, and he walked away. He walked away, and he never spoke about her to anybody for 40 years. And Hannah, Walter pushed a piece of paper across the desk. It was a photocopy, an old one, a newspaper clipping, yellow with age. Sarah looked. It was an article from the Portland Press Herald, dated 3 months ago. The headline read, Maine woman, 71, searches for birth, mother taken from her in 1961. There was a photograph, a woman in her 70s, gray hair, kind eyes, a face that looked like the little girl in the photograph in the Bible, all grown up. The article said the woman's name was Hannah Bellamy Renner, that she had grown up believing her mother had died in childbirth, that she had only learned the truth 4 months ago after the death of her own grandmother, the last living person from the Bellamy generation that had taken her. The grandmother had left a letter, a confession. Hannah had been searching since. Walter said, "She wrote to me last month. She found my name through old newspaper records. She wanted to know if anybody in Brushwood remembered her mother." Sarah looked up. "What did you tell her?" "I told her everything. I gave her Silas's address. He still lives 40 minutes from here, in the old family house. I haven't heard from her since. I don't know if she's contacted him." Sarah folded the photocopy very carefully. She put it in her coat pocket. She said, "I have to go home." Walter said, "Sarah." She stopped. "That cottage was waiting. Do you understand me? That cottage was waiting for somebody. Ruth would have wanted you there. I know she would have. So would Silas. He didn't burn it down. He didn't sell the land. He kept it. For decades, he kept it, like he was holding the door open." Sarah nodded. She didn't trust her voice. She walked out of the pharmacy into the snow. She walked 4 miles back to the cottage, and the whole way she could feel Ruth Mercer walking next to her, not as a ghost, as a woman who had walked these same woods with the same boots in the same snow, with the same broken heart, 65 years before. That night, after Caleb was asleep, Sarah did something she hadn't planned to do. She took the lantern off its hook, the old one, rusted, wickless. She cleaned it. She found a wick and a tin in the cellar. She found a small bottle of oil in the same tin. The label was so faded she couldn't read it. She didn't care. It was oil. It would burn. She filled the lantern. She trimmed the wick. She lit it. The flame steadied. The glass globe glowed a soft amber. She carried it out to the porch. She set it on the rail, where it could be seen from a long way off. She went back inside. She didn't lock the door. She sat in the chair by the stove, with the Bible in her lap, with Ruth's letter folded inside. And she waited. The wind moved the pine trees. The snow fell. The fire ticked. The lantern burned. Around 3 a.m, Sarah heard the porch step creak. Just one. The second step on the right side. She didn't get up. She didn't move. She heard the door handle turn. She heard the door push open. She heard a man's boots come slow across the threshold. "Stop! Take off the snow at the door." She heard the door close. She heard him cross to the stove. She kept her eyes on the Bible in her lap. When she finally looked up, he was standing in the firelight. He was old, maybe 76. White hair under a wool cap, a beard going gray, a heavy canvas coat, hands that had spent a lifetime outdoors, tall, stooped a little at the shoulders. His eyes were the color of weak coffee. They were full of tears. He took off his cap. He held it in both hands, the way a man holds his cap at a funeral, or in church, or in the presence of something he thinks is sacred. He said, "My name is Silas Mercer." Sarah said, "I know. You read her letter." "Yes." His hands tightened on the cap. "I never read it." "Why?" "'Cause I knew what was in it. And I couldn't." He looked around the cottage, slow. His eyes moved over the stove, the shelves, the chair where Caleb was sleeping, the window with Daniel's photograph on the sill. He said, "It looks like a home in here. It is one. It hasn't been one in a long time. I know." He didn't sit. She didn't invite him to. They both knew that wasn't a sitting kind of conversation. He said, I'm sorry I scared you." "You didn't scare me. You moved the axe. I move it every night." He almost smiled. Just the corner, just a little, like he hadn't smiled in so long he wasn't sure how. He said, "When I saw the smoke, the first morning, out of the chimney, after 58 years, I thought he stopped. He worked his jaw. I thought I was seeing things. I came closer. I saw a child's footprints in the snow next to a woman's. And I sat down in the trees and I cried like I haven't cried since the day I buried her." Sarah didn't speak. "I didn't know what to do. I couldn't come in, I couldn't knock. What was I going to say? Hello, I am the brother of the woman who used to live here, the one who died of grief. Please don't run away. I wouldn't have run. You didn't know that yet. He shifted the cap in his hands. He said, Walter Crane called me last night. He said you'd been in, he said you knew. He said somebody finally knew. Sarah said, did you go see Hannah? He looked at her. You read about Hannah. Walter showed me the article. Silas's eyes filled again. I wrote to her 2 months ago. I haven't sent the letter. I've written it 9 times. I have it on the kitchen table at my house. I have not been able to put it in the mailbox. Why? Because if I put it in the mailbox, she becomes real. And if she becomes real, then she might come. And if she comes, I might lose her too. Sarah thought about Daniel. She thought about how many times she had wanted to write his name on a Christmas card this year, just to keep him part of the list. She said, Silas, you have to send it. He looked at her. She said, she has been looking for 64 years. Even if she didn't know it for most of them, she's been looking. She wrote to Walter. She put her face in a newspaper. She is reaching for her mother. And her mother is gone. But you are not gone. You are right here. And if you do not put that letter in the mailbox tomorrow morning, you will die having denied a woman the only piece of her mother she has left. Silas's shoulders started to shake. He didn't make a sound. He just stood there in the firelight with his cap in his hands and his shoulders shaking. Sarah stood up. She crossed the room. She did something she had not expected to do. She put her arms around an old man she had never met before that night, and she held him while he cried. He cried for his sister. He cried for his niece. He cried for the cottage that had stood empty. He cried for the 40 years of his life that he had spent walking through these woods alone. She let him cry. She didn't say anything. She just held him, the way her mother had held her once, the way she had held Caleb at the funeral, the way Ruth had held Hannah in the photograph from 1961, the way one human being holds another when the world has been too much for too long. He sent the letter the next morning. He drove into Brushwood at first light. He put it in the mailbox in front of the post office. He stood there for a long time after he'd let the slot close, as if he wasn't sure it had really happened. Then he drove back out to the cottage. He had brought tools, real tools, a saw, a hammer, a box of nails, a roll of tar paper, a pair of work gloves that he handed to Sarah without a word. He fixed the roof in one day, by himself. He was 76 years old, and he climbed up there with his own ladder, and he stripped the sagging section, and he laid new boards he'd cut at the lumber yard in town. By evening, the cottage had a roof that wouldn't leak. He came back the next day. He fixed the broken window. He came back the day after that. He cleaned out the chimney with a wire brush and a rope and a sandbag. He showed Caleb how to lower the sandbag and pull it back up. Caleb did it for 2 hours, laughing, actually laughing. Sarah stood in the doorway watching them, her hand pressed to her mouth. Caleb had not laughed like that since October. Silas pretended not to notice her crying. Hannah's reply came 8 days later. A postcard, forwarded from Walter's pharmacy. Silas brought it out to the cottage in the late afternoon. He stood on the porch holding it like it weighed 100 pounds. He said, she wants to come. Sarah said, when? As soon as she can. She lives in Oregon now. She'll have to fly. She said she'll call Walter to set a date. He looked at the postcard. He said, she used the word home. She said she's coming home. Sarah, she doesn't even know what the home looks like. She doesn't know there's a cottage. I don't think I ever told her in the letter. I don't think I knew how. And she said home. He sat down on the porch step, hard, like his legs had stopped working. Sarah sat next to him. They watched the snow. They didn't speak. Some things don't need words. It was the next morning that Margaret came. The sound of the car came up the logging road before they saw it. Sarah was at the stove. Caleb was at the table. Silas had gone home for the night and would be back at noon. The cottage smelled like coffee and roasted apples. Sarah heard the engine, and her hand froze on the kettle. She knew that engine. She walked to the door. She opened it. A black sedan. New, expensive, the kind of car that did not belong on a logging road. It stopped at the end of the path. A woman got out, 64 years old, cream blouse, hairpin back, Margaret Whitlock. Sarah's stomach dropped through her shoes. Margaret looked at her across the path. She did not approach. She stood at the car. She held something in her hand. Sarah said to Caleb without turning, "Stay inside, baby. Mama's just going to the path for a minute. Don't open this door for anything. Do you hear me?" Caleb said, "Yes, Mama." Sarah closed the door behind her. She walked, slow, her hands at her sides. She did not look back at the cottage. She did not want Caleb to see this. She did not know what this was yet. She stopped 10 feet from Margaret. Margaret's face was different than the last time Sarah had seen it. Thinner, older. The certainty in her jaw was gone. She held out what was in her hand. A small wooden box, the kind people keep ashes in. She said, "These are Daniel's. I had him cremated. I should have asked you. I'm sorry." Sarah did not take the box. Margaret stood there with her arm out. She said, "Howard sold the house. He took the money. He's in Florida. He hasn't called me in 6 weeks. I'm 64 years old, Sarah. I am living in a one-bedroom rental in Bangor, and I have nobody." Sarah said, "What do you want, Margaret?" Margaret's eyes filled. She said, "I want to give you your husband. I want to give him to his son. That is all I want from this drive. I am not asking to come in. I am not asking for forgiveness. I just thought he should be where you are, wherever that is." Sarah looked at the box. She thought about Caleb behind the door. She thought about Daniel. She thought about a woman named Ruth who had been turned away by people who shared her blood, and a woman named Margaret who had turned away a woman who shared her son's bed. She thought, "I am not going to be like Ruth, but I am also not going to lie to myself." She took the box. She did not invite Margaret onto the porch. She did not invite her into the cottage. She said, "Thank you for bringing him." Margaret nodded. Once, she said, "Caleb, does he?" Sarah said, "He's doing well. He's strong. He laughs again. He has people who love him." Margaret's face moved. It moved in a way Sarah had never seen it move. She said, "I'm glad." Sarah nodded. That was all. That was the end of the conversation. Margaret got back in the car. She closed the door. She backed up the logging road slowly. She drove away. Sarah stood at the end of the path for a long time after the car was gone. Then she walked back inside. She set the wooden box on the windowsill next to the photograph of Daniel holding Caleb the day he was born. Caleb looked up from the table. He said, "Mama, what's that?" Sarah said, "That's your daddy, baby. He came home." Caleb thought for a long time. He looked at the box. He looked at the photograph next to it. He looked at Sarah. He said, "Where are we going to put him?" Sarah looked out the window. Past the garden rows, past the apple orchard, to the old walnut tree at the edge of the field, where Ruth lay quiet in the warm soil. She said, "Under the tree, baby, with Ruth. So she has company. And so Daddy isn't alone either." Caleb nodded. Like that made sense to him. Like he was the kind of boy who understood the kind of family the world doesn't always make room for. Hannah arrived 3 weeks later. She came in a rental car, with a small suitcase, with a winter coat she had clearly bought for this trip. Walter brought her out from town. Sarah saw the car coming up the logging road through the kitchen window. She had been watching all morning. The car stopped at the end of the path. The doors opened. A small woman stepped out, 71 years old, white hair cut short, a face that had been a little girl's face once. In a photograph, summer of 1961, she stood at the end of the path. She didn't move. She looked at the cottage. She looked at the garden rows. She looked at the walnut tree. She put her hand over her mouth. Sarah didn't go out to her. Not yet. This wasn't her moment. Silas came around the side of the cottage. He had been waiting back there. He had not been able to be at the path when she got out of the car. He had told Sarah this. He had said, I have to walk to her. I have to. It's the only way I'll know my legs are real. He walked across the snow toward his niece. Slow, steady, an old man crossing decades. Hannah saw him. She didn't move. She just looked at him. When he was 10 feet away, he stopped. He said, Hannah. She said, Uncle Silas. She said it like she had been practicing the word for 64 years, like it was a word she had only ever spoken in her own kitchen, alone, into the air. To see how it sounded, she walked the last 10 feet. She put her arms around him. She put her face against his shoulder. And they stood there in the snow in the front yard of a cottage that had been waiting half a century for this exact thing to happen. Sarah watched from the window. Caleb stood next to her. He had his hand on her sleeve. He said, Mama, who is that lady? Sarah said, That's the little girl from the picture, baby. Caleb thought about it. He said, She's not little anymore. Sarah laughed. Through her tears, she picked him up. He was getting too big to pick up. She didn't care. She held him on her hip, and they watched through the window. She said, No, baby, she's not little anymore, but she's home now. That's the important part. Hannah stayed for 3 days. The first day, Silas walked her to the walnut tree. He showed her where Ruth was buried. There was no headstone. He had wanted to make one. He had never been able to. Hannah didn't ask why. She knelt in the snow, and she put her hand flat on the ground, and she sat there for an hour, talking quietly. Sarah couldn't hear what she said. She didn't try to. The second day, Hannah came inside. Sarah gave her the Bible. She gave her the photograph. She gave her the letter from 1967. Hannah read the letter in the chair by the stove. She did not cry while she read it. She read it twice, and then a third time. And then she folded it carefully and held it in her lap. And then she cried, quietly, without shaking, tears running down her face and her hands folded over her mother's letter. She said to Sarah, Thank you. Sarah said, I didn't do anything. Hannah said, You did everything. You kept the house warm. You read her letter. You called my uncle. You are the reason this is happening. You don't get to tell me you didn't do anything. The third day, Hannah brought a folder. She put it on the table in front of Sarah. She said, I've talked to my attorney in Portland. The land was always Silas's. He inherited it from his uncle in 1955. He's never put it in anybody's name since. He wants to sign it over to you. The cottage, the orchard, the walnut tree, the spring, all of it. Sarah stared at her. She said, I can't accept that. Hannah said, You can. Silas said, You will. Sarah said, This is your inheritance. Hannah shook her head. She said, My inheritance is the letter, Sarah. My inheritance is knowing my mother loved me. My inheritance is meeting my uncle before he dies. My inheritance is sitting in the room where she sat. The cottage belongs to whoever takes care of it. My mother said so. In her own letter, she said, Take care of it the way I would have, and you are doing that, so it is yours. She slid the folder across the table. Sarah put her hand on it. She did not pick it up. She did not push it back. She just put her hand on it, and she nodded, slowly. Once, Silas said, Welcome home. Sarah did not trust her voice to answer. Caleb walked over to Hannah. He had been listening from the corner the whole time. He was holding the wooden truck. He looked up at her. He said, Are you going to come back? Hannah knelt down in front of him. She put her hand on his small shoulder, the way Ruth had touched her shoulder in the photograph from 1961. She said, Every summer, sweetheart. I'm going to come back every summer for as long as I'm alive. Is that all right with you? He thought about it. He said, You can sleep in the chair if you want, but Mama gets the floor. That's where Mama sleeps. Hannah laughed, real laughter, through her tears. She said, Deal. Spring came late that year. It always does in Maine. By the time the snow melted, Sarah had been in the cottage for 5 months. She had a job then, a real one. 3 days a week at the small clinic in Brushwood. Walter Crane had introduced her to the doctor there. A woman in her 60s named Dr. Annette Mallory. Dr. Mallory had looked at Sarah's records from Mercy General. She had looked at Sarah. She had said, I've been looking for somebody steady for 2 years. That was all. That was the whole interview. Sarah took Caleb into town for school the same week she started work. He rode the bus from the end of the logging road. He had a teacher named Mrs. Lutz, who he was a little bit in love with. He brought home drawings of pine trees and walnut trees and stoves and chairs. He drew Sarah holding a fish. Silas came out every Sunday for dinner. He was teaching Caleb to whittle. He had given Caleb his own pocket knife, a small one. He'd shown him how to use it without cutting himself. Sarah had thought about objecting. She hadn't. She had watched her son's small hands learn an old man's craft, and she had let it happen. Caleb called him Grandpa Silas. By the second month, Silas pretended that didn't make him cry. Sarah pretended she didn't see. The garden came back slowly. Sarah didn't try to grow flowers from Ruth's old seeds. She knew better. The seeds were gone. 60 years of frost and damp had taken them. What she did was buy new seeds at the feed store in Brushwood. Peas, beans, tomatoes, lettuce. She turned the soil that Ruth had loved. She planted the seeds in the same rows, and she let the rows be Ruth's again. In May, she found one wild rose growing at the edge of the garden, a pale pink one, bent over from the weight of its own flower. It had not been planted by Sarah. It must have come up from a root that had survived everything. Sarah did not pick it. She let it grow. On a quiet Sunday in June, Sarah and Caleb and Silas walked together to the walnut tree. Sarah carried the wooden box. Caleb carried the small spade Silas had given him. Silas carried nothing. He had carried enough. They dug a small hole next to the place where Ruth lay. Not deep, just enough. Sarah opened the box. She did not look inside. She tipped it gently into the earth. She watched the gray dust settle into the dark soil. She said, "There you are, my love. You're with somebody good. She'll look after you, and you'll look after her." Caleb put a small carved fish on top, the one he'd whittled with Silas's knife, the one with the curving grain. They covered the place together. The wild rose was blooming 6 feet away. They walked back to the cottage in silence. Sarah made supper. Silas stayed late. Caleb fell asleep at the table with his head on his arm. Sarah carried her son to bed. She tucked the wooden truck under his hand. She kissed his forehead. She closed the door behind her. She came back into the main room. Silas was at the stove, washing the supper plates. He said, without turning, "Are you all right?" Sarah said, "Yes." He said, "Good." He said it the way fathers say it, the way men who have nothing else to give say the only thing they can give. He finished the dishes. He put on his coat. He squeezed her shoulder once on his way out. He drove home through the cold June twilight. Sarah sat in the chair by the stove. She opened the Bible. She turned to the page with Ruth's letter inside. She picked up the pencil from the table. Below Ruth's last line, "I love you, I love you, I love you," Sarah wrote in her own hand. "Ruth, the cottage is warm, the garden is planted, your daughter came home, so did mine. Thank you for waiting." She closed the Bible. She set it on the windowsill, next to the photograph of Daniel, next to the empty space where the wooden box had been. Outside, the wind moved through the pine trees. Inside, the fire crackled. A small, forgotten cottage in a forgotten corner of the woods, where two mothers, 64 years apart, had each lost a husband and walked into the snow with a child in their arms. One of them did not make it out. The other one did, because the first one had built a house and planted a garden and dug a spring and waited. The world had told both of them they did not belong. The world had been wrong. And on a quiet evening in June, in a cottage that had stood empty for 58 years, a woman named Sarah Whitlock watched the smoke rise from the chimney and understood at last what Walter Crane had meant. That cottage was waiting for somebody. It had been waiting for her.